I used to think Creepy Cove Community Church was just another sleepy little congregation. The kind of place where old hymns drifted out of stained glass windows, and the pastor always smelled faintly of coffee and peppermint. Every small town has one, right? That modest, white-steepled landmark that anchors the community. A place you pass on Sunday mornings, see the cars lined up neatly in the gravel lot, and think nothing more of it. But I was wrong. I know that now, because the last time I sat in one of those pews, I realized I wasn't listening to a sermon. I was listening to something else. The service began normally enough. Sunlight spilled through the windows, catching in the dust as the choir filed in. Their robes swished softly, faces serene, smiles practiced and warm. For a second, it even reminded me of my own childhood Sundays, sticky church bulletins, off-key organs, people who seemed too harmless to ever cause real harm. But then the singing started. At first it was beautiful. I'll admit that. A low harmony, rich and layered, rising together like a tide. But as I sat there, I noticed it wasn't English. It wasn't Latin either, or any language I'd ever heard. The syllables twisted strangely in my ears, almost liquid, as though the voices weren't forming words so much as dragging sound up from somewhere deep and wet. And then came the silence. One moment the church was alive with sound, the next, it was dead quiet. Not a shuffle, not a cough, not even the creak of old wood beneath a restless body. Just silence, heavy and deliberate. Dozens of eyes turned all at once toward me. Their faces were still kind, still smiling, but not a single person blinked. I should have left then. I should have run while I still could. Instead, I sat frozen, my heart pounding, as Pastor Grayson stepped up to the pulpit and spoke my full name. Not brother, not friend, not even visitor. He said my name as though I'd been expected, as though I had been chosen. That was my first glimpse of what Creepy Cove really was. To understand how I ended up there, you need to know how it started. Creepy Cove wasn't the sort of place you found on a map. It wasn't a destination. It was the kind of town you stumbled into on a detour. The kind of name you chuckled at when you saw it painted on the wooden welcome sign, weathered by sea air. I thought it was charming at first, almost quaint. The town itself sat cradled against the coastline, a scattering of salt-bleached houses and narrow streets that all seemed to funnel down toward the harbor. Fishing boats bobbed at their moorings, nets drying on racks, gulls wheeling overhead with their endless mournful cries. On the surface, it was picturesque, the kind of place you'd expect to see on a postcard or the cover of a small-town magazine. And yet, it felt staged. Everyone I met was unfailingly polite. Smiles that lasted a little too long, handshakes that lingered just a little too firm. When I told them I was new in town, their responses were almost identical. Welcome, welcome. You'll feel right at home here. Make sure you stop by the church on Sunday. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an expectation. I noticed quickly that the church wasn't just another building here. It was the building. White steeple rising above the rooftops, bell visible from nearly every street. The shops all had flyers for church events taped in their windows. The diner had a corkboard with photos of community picnics, baptisms, bake sales. Even the gas station clerk, a guy who looked like he hadn't smiled in 20 years, brightened up when he mentioned the fellowship at Creepy Cove Community Church. I thought it was wholesome at first, maybe even comforting. A tight-knit town united by faith, keeping old traditions alive. But the longer I stayed, the more the cracks began to show. Every Sunday, without fail, the entire town shut down. Not just shops, not just businesses, everything. Streets empty, blinds drawn, doors locked. If you weren't at church, you might as well not exist. The kids were the strangest. They played in the streets during the week, laughing and shrieking like kids do. But whenever I asked them about Sunday services, they went quiet. Their smiles faltered. Their eyes darted to the church on the hill. One boy, maybe 9 or 10, whispered something I'll never forget. "Don't let them hear your silence," I pressed him. But before he could say more, his mother appeared out of nowhere. gripping his shoulder tightly and giving me a smile so sharp it felt like a warning. Then there were the flyers. At first glance, they looked ordinary. Lists of bake sales, charity drives, hymn nights. But if you looked closely, the wording was off. Phrases like, "All voices must join," "Silence drowns," and one line half-smudged with ink that read, "Those who refuse are carried by the tide." I laughed it off when I first noticed. Small towns have their quirks, right? Traditions that don't make sense to outsiders. But something about Creepy Cove's obsession with their church felt heavier, more urgent. Like their entire existence was balanced on what happened in that building. And every conversation ended the same way. A reminder, friendly but firm, that I should attend. That it was important, that it was expected. I should have taken it as a warning. Instead, I took it as an invitation. And that's how I found myself sitting in those pews for the first time, waiting to hear the sermon that would change everything. The first Sunday I stepped into Creepy Cove Community Church, the air felt thicker somehow, as though it carried the weight of every breath that had ever been taken inside. The building itself wasn't remarkable from the outside. White clapboard walls, tall windows, a steeple tipped with a cross weathered green by salt. But once I walked through those double doors, I understood why the whole town bent itself around this place. The sanctuary was immaculate. Not just clean, perfect. The pews gleamed with fresh polish, cushions free of stains or wear. Candles burned in sconces along the walls, their flames tall and steady, not a single flicker of draft disturbing them. The stained glass was so vivid it almost glowed on its own, as though the sun outside bent itself to illuminate only this building. People were already seated when I arrived, but not a single head turned to look at me. Not one. They all faced forward, backs rigid, hands folded neatly in their laps. For a moment I thought maybe I'd walked in late, that the service had already begun. But the silence told me otherwise. It wasn't the casual murmur you'd expect before worship. It was the kind of silence you could drown in, thick and deliberate, as if they were all waiting. A woman in a flowered dress touched my arm gently. Her smile stretched just wide enough to make my skin prickle. "Welcome," she whispered, guiding me to a pew near the middle. The moment I sat down, her hand slipped away and she returned to her place without another word. The organ began to play. Slow, deliberate notes, each one reverberating through my ribs, and then the choir rose. They sang beautifully, I won't deny that, but it was wrong. Too perfect, too synchronized. Their voices didn't overlap or waver. They rose and fell as though every throat belonged to a single body. The words weren't English, though a syllable here and there mimicked it, close enough to trick your ear, far enough to unsettle it. I felt the sound crawling into me, seeping into my bones. Then Pastor Grayson appeared. He was a tall man, shoulders broad beneath his black robes. His hair was silver, his face weathered, but his eyes were young, sharp, alive in a way that made it hard to meet his gaze for more than a moment. When he raised his arms, the congregation exhaled as one, like they'd been holding their breath for him. "Brothers, sisters," he said, his voice smooth and deep. "The tide welcomes us. The tide sustains us. The tide hears us." The words should have sounded absurd. Instead, the way he spoke them left me trembling. Every syllable rolled out like a secret I wasn't supposed to know but couldn't forget. And then he looked at me, not just a glance. His eyes locked onto mine, unblinking, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "And we welcome," he said softly, "our new brother." My name followed. My full name. A ripple passed through the congregation. Heads turned toward me, smiles blooming like flowers opening to the sun. Dozens of eyes fixed on me, and for a heartbeat I felt like prey frozen in a field of predators. I tried to smile back, to play along, but my lips barely moved. My heart hammered. How did he know my name? I hadn't spoken to him. I hadn't introduced myself to anyone but the gas station clerk and the woman who seated me. Pastor Grayson's smile deepened, as though he'd plucked the thought straight from my skull. "The tide knows us all," he said, returning his gaze to the pulpit. The sermon that followed should have been ordinary. Bible verses, lessons about kindness, charity, humility. And yes, those things were there, but woven between them were other words. Words that slithered beneath the familiar, slipping into places where they didn't belong. "Silence drowns," he intoned. "All voices must join. Those who are absent are carried away." The congregation repeated after him, perfectly in sync. The cadence was so smooth, so flawless, it didn't even sound human anymore. By the time the final hymn began, I felt dizzy, my vision swimming as though I'd been underwater too long. The music built, voices rising higher and higher until I swore I could hear another sound beneath them. Something low, something vast, something that didn't belong to any human throat. And then just as suddenly it stopped. The silence slammed down again, heavy as stone. Everyone's heads turned once more, every eye pinned on me. Their smiles hadn't changed, but their stillness made my skin crawl. That was when I realized this wasn't just worship. This was something else. Something I shouldn't have been part of. That should have been my first warning. But curiosity, it's a dangerous thing, I told myself I wouldn't go back. That first service was enough, that silence, those voices. Pastor Grayson calling me out by name like he'd known me his entire life. I walked out of that building with my heart hammering and my palms slick, vowing I'd never step foot inside again. But I did. Curiosity doesn't let go easily, especially when it's tangled up with fear. For days afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about the way the congregation had moved in perfect unison, the strange words in their hymns, the way the entire town seemed to pivot around that single building. And then there were the smiles, always the smiles. So I went back, and that's when I started noticing things. At first, it was small details. The bulletin board in the entryway had old photos tacked up, church picnics, baptisms, community events. But some of the faces in those photos had been carefully scratched out, as though someone didn't want them remembered. Below the pictures were lists of names, handwritten on yellowing paper, a roll call of sorts with neat check marks beside each one. But here and there in red ink were single words: drowned, departed, silent. I asked one of the deacons about it, a kindly old man who carried himself with the sort of calm you only find in small towns. He smiled at me, patted my shoulder, and said, "Oh, those are just housekeeping notes." Then he steered me away before I could ask anything more. That was when I began paying closer attention to the congregation itself. Outside of the church, they were polite, cheerful, even helpful. They ran the diner, the shops, the bait store by the docks. They waved when you passed them on the street. But the moment I tried to bring up the church, the atmosphere changed. Their smiles held, but their eyes hardened, and the subject shifted with unnatural speed. The children disturbed me most. I'd see them playing near the harbor, drawing shapes in the sand with sticks. At first I thought they were doodling waves or fish or maybe spirals for fun. But then I looked closer. The symbols repeated again and again, eyes staring wide. Concentric circles drawn like ripples spreading outward. Crude human figures standing in water up to their necks. I asked a little girl about one once, crouching beside her as she traced the spiral into the sand. "What's that supposed to be?" I asked, keeping my tone light. She didn't look up. Her voice was flat, practiced. The song. When I asked her to explain, she glanced over her shoulder, and just like before, a parent appeared instantly, herding her away with a smile stretched too wide across her face. And then there were the pamphlets. They sat stacked neatly at the back of the church, printed on pale blue paper with titles like "The Voice That Guides Us" and "Harmony of the Tide." I picked one up when nobody was looking, tucking it into my coat pocket. Later that night in my rented room above the harbor, I read it. The words made no sense. at least not in the way sermons usually do. There were lines about raising your voice to the waves, about surrendering silence to the current. One passage chilled me to the bone. Those who do not join the song are claimed by the undertow. The voice will not be denied. All must sing, for silence is death. I dropped the pamphlet like it was burning my hands. The next morning, I went back to the church determined to grab more of them, to prove to myself that it wasn't just some bizarre misprint. But when I arrived, the pamphlets were gone. Not a single copy remained. In their place was a different stack, plain white covers reading weekly announcements. Harmless. Ordinary. When I asked about the ones from before, the usher frowned in genuine confusion. "We've never printed anything like that," he said, his tone firm, final. But I knew what I'd read. The deeper I looked, the stranger it became. The town seemed bound to the church by something stronger than tradition. The way the people stared at me, the way they smiled too hard, the way their children whispered about songs and tides. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd walked into something far older and far darker than Sunday sermons. I wanted to believe it was paranoia, that small towns are just quirky, insular, protective of their ways. But the whispers I started hearing at night convinced me otherwise. Low voices carrying on the sea breeze, drifting through my window as I lay awake. Not words exactly, more like fragments of hymns. Always the same refrain, carried on a tune I almost recognized yet couldn't hum once the sound faded. That's when I realized I wasn't imagining it. Something was happening in Creepy Cove, and the church was at the center of it. And I wasn't sure if I'd been invited or chosen. The first warning didn't come from anyone inside the church. It came from a stranger at the diner. It was late one night, a Tuesday, and I'd gone in for coffee just to feel less alone. The place was nearly empty, just me, a waitress humming softly to herself, and a man hunched in the corner booth with a plate of cold fries in front of him. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were red, his beard unkempt, his clothes salt-stained like he just crawled off a boat. When I slid onto a stool at the counter, he raised his head and stared at me. "Not curious, not friendly, just knowing you went," he said. His voice was hoarse, ragged. I blinked. "Excuse me?" He nodded once, slow. "You went to the church." The waitress shot him a sharp look and shook her head as though warning him to keep quiet. But the man ignored her. He leaned closer, his words low and urgent. "Don't let them hear your silence." I tried to press him, to ask what he meant, but he shoved out of the booth and left, the bell above the door jangling violently behind him. The waitress hurried over, plastering on a smile. "Don't mind him," she said too quickly. "Old fisherman. Talks nonsense," but I remembered the boy in the street who'd whispered the same words. "Don't let them hear your silence." It wasn't the last time I heard it either. The next warning came from the harbor. I was walking along the docks when I noticed an old fisherman sitting on an overturned bucket, mending a net with hands that looked more like driftwood than flesh. He squinted up at me as I passed. "You're new here," he rasped. "They like new voices." I stopped in my tracks. "What do you mean?" He looked back down at his net, weaving the line with slow, methodical movements. "They like voices that carry. Strong ones. But they don't like quiet." No, they don't like quiet one bit." Before I could ask more, a younger man appeared at the far end of the dock, calling out to him. The old fisherman went silent instantly, his eyes dropping back to his work. When I tried to push him, he only muttered, "Tides turning," and refused to say anything else. I might have written it off as ramblings if not for the third warning. This one came from a teenager, one of the few I'd seen lingering around town without the constant glow of that Stepford smile. She was hanging around the edge of the harbor, hoodie pulled tight against the wind, earbuds dangling but not playing. I caught her staring at me, and when I approached, she didn't look away. "You've been going," she said flatly. "To the church?" I asked. She gave a bitter laugh. "Where else? That's all this town is." I waited, hoping she'd say more, and finally she did. You think it's about God? It's not. It's about the voice. My stomach tightened. What voice? She looked out at the water, her expression hard. The one under the waves. The one they all serve. That's why they sing. Not for faith. Not for joy. They sing so it doesn't rise. I wanted to call her crazy. I wanted to dismiss her words the way I'd tried to dismiss the fisherman and the drifter in the diner. But the conviction in her tone, the bitterness in her eyes froze me. What happens if they don't sing? I asked before I could stop myself. She finally looked back at me. Her face was pale, her voice a whisper. Then it hears the silence. Before I could press her, a group of other teens walked by. Instantly, she shut down, shoving her earbuds back in and turning away from me. I went back to my room that night with her words echoing in my skull. The voice beneath the waves. I thought of the pamphlet I'd stolen, the line about silence being death. I thought about the hymns that never used words I could understand. And for the first time, I wondered if Creepy Cove's devotion wasn't to God at all. The more I thought about it, the more everything made sense. The prosperity of the town despite its isolation. The way every business, every person, orbited around the church like planets around a sun. The way the congregation sang in perfect harmony, as though their lives depended on it. Because maybe they did. The next Sunday, when I sat in those pews again, I listened differently. I paid attention not to the surface of the sermon, but to what writhed beneath it. Pastor Grayson's words weren't just lessons in morality. They were promises, contracts, pleas to something unseen. The tide hears us, he said, voice echoing off the rafters. The tide spares us. We must give voice or we are drowned. The congregation repeated it in flawless unison. And that was the moment I realized the warnings weren't just paranoia. They were instructions, rules, survival tips for living in a town built on something other than faith. I should have left then, packed my bags, taken the first road out, but I didn't, because deep down I needed to know if it was real. And when you go looking for answers in a place like Creepy Cove, you always find more than you bargained for. I thought I had seen the worst of Creepy Cove Community Church. The smiles, the whispers, the sermons that bled strange words between familiar scripture. But I hadn't. The true heart of Creepy Cove didn't beat on Sunday mornings. It pulsed at midnight. I learned about the service by accident. I'd left the diner late one night, the streets empty, the harbor black and still. As I passed the church on my way back to my rented room, I heard it. The faintest hum of voices. Not just one or two, but dozens. Rising and falling in a rhythm too precise to be chance. The doors were shut, the windows dark, but the sound leaked out from the cracks between the boards. My curiosity won out over caution. I hid in the shadows across the street and waited. Soon I saw them. Figures approaching in silence, slipping through alleys and side streets, converging on the church like moths drawn to a flame. They didn't come in their Sunday best this time. No dresses, no pressed suits. Just robes, dark, heavy, hooded. Their faces vanished beneath fabric, their footsteps muffled on the dirt road. One by one, they filed inside, the heavy doors closing behind them.